Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we journey back to the English countryside of the 14th century, to a time when the pace of life moved with the seasons, and the work of transforming sheep's fleece into cloth was the foundation of countless ordinary lives. This is not a story of kings or battles, but of hands that worked slowly, steadily, through tasks that had been performed the same way for generations. The wool trade was England's lifeblood during the medieval period. But before wool became wealth, before it travelled to distant markets or graced the backs of nobles, it began as a greasy matted fleece on the back of a sheep. And between that sheep and a finished piece of cloth lay months of patient, methodical labour. Tonight, we will follow that journey. Not hurriedly, but at the pace at which medieval people would have experienced it. We will spend time with shepherds in their fields, watching sheep graze on spring grass. We will sit with women at their spinning wheels, feeling the rhythm of the treadle and the gentle pull of fibre becoming thread. We will listen to the steady thump of the loom and understand the careful attention required to weave each thread into place. There is nothing dramatic here, nothing urgent. Just the slow, persistent work of creating something useful from raw material. The kind of work that filled days and years, that marked the passage of time through its own gentle rhythms. So settle in. Let the concerns of the day fade, and let us begin at the beginning, in a meadow where sheep graze, under a sky that knew no hurry. In the spring of 1347, in a village we will call Ashworth, the meadows were dotted with sheep. Not the clean, white, fluffy creatures you might imagine, but sturdy, practical animals with coarse, oily wool that ranged from cream to brown to grey. These were medieval sheep, smaller than their modern descendants, bred not for tenderness of meat or softness of fleece, but for hardiness. They needed to survive on sparse grazing, to withstand cold winters, to thrive with minimal human intervention. A shepherd named Thomas watched over a flock of about 60 sheep. His was not a dramatic occupation. Most days passed without incident. He would rise before dawn, while the sky was still more dark than light, that particular shade of deep blue that precedes sunrise. His cottage was small, just one room with a packed earth floor and a hearth where coals from the previous evening still glowed faintly. He would blow on these coals, add a few sticks of kindling, and wait for the flames to catch before setting a pot of water to warm. His breakfast was always the same. Bread, perhaps a day or two old, dipped in ale to soften it. Sometimes there might be a bit of cheese, hard and strong-flavoured, or an onion to eat alongside the bread. He ate slowly, methodically, not because he was savouring the food particularly, but because there was no reason to rush. The sheep would be where they always were. They would need him when they needed him, and a few minutes made no difference. When he finished eating, Thomas would take his staff, worn smooth from years of handling, and walk to where the flock had spent the night. In good weather, they often stayed in the meadow itself, clustered together in a loose group. Their instinct for safety in numbers, keeping them close, even without a pen. In worse weather, or when predators had been spotted, they would be driven to an enclosure near the village. But for now, the meadow sufficed. As Thomas approached, some of the sheep would lift their heads briefly, recognize him, and return to their grazing. Others wouldn't even pause. He knew each animal by sight, could tell at a glance if one was limping or if another had strayed. There was the ewe with the torn ear, acquired in some forgotten accident years ago. There was the ram with the slightly darker face, the oldest male in the flock. There was the younger ewe who always grazed at the edge of the group, slightly apart from the others. The sheep moved across the meadow in a loose cluster, heads down, pulling at grass with a steady, rhythmic motion. Their jaws worked constantly, side to side, grinding the grass between their teeth. The sound was soft but persistent, a collective munching that became almost like background noise, easy to forget until you listened for it specifically. Occasionally, one would bleat, a sound somewhere between a cry and a complaint, though what they were complaining about Thomas couldn't say. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps that was simply what sheep did. There was no hurry in their movement. They would take a few steps, lower their heads, eat for a while, then take a few more steps. The meadow was large enough that they could spend the entire day working their way across it and not run out of grass. The grass itself was not lush and thick like a modern pasture, but mixed with wild flowers, low-growing herbs and patches of clover. The sheep were not particular. They ate what was available, converting it all into wool and meat through the slow alchemy of digestion. Thomas carried his staff everywhere, leaning on it as he walked, using it occasionally to guide a sheep that had wandered too far from the group, or to push aside brambles when checking the boundaries of the pasture. The staff was made from hazelwood, cut from a coppice tree when Thomas was still a young man. His father had shown him how to select a straight branch, how to trim it, how to harden the tip in fire. That staff had lasted 20 years, and would probably last 20 more. He would walk the perimeter of the meadow each morning, not because he expected problems, but because it was what one did. He checked the hedgerows for gaps where a sheep might push through. He looked for signs of foxes or dogs, though serious predators were rare in this settled countryside. He noted which sections of the meadow had been heavily grazed and which still had good grass, planning where to move the flock in the coming days. Most of the morning, though, Thomas simply stood or sat watching. He might sit on a particular boulder that had probably been in that field since long before there was a village, its surface smooth and slightly concave from centuries of rain and wind. From there, he could see the entire flock, and beyond them, the patchwork of fields that made up the villages and lands, and beyond that, the darker line of forest on the horizon. Sometimes he would pull out a piece of bread, saved from breakfast, and chew it slowly, watching the sheep. Sometimes he would whittle, taking a piece of wood from his pocket and his small knife, and shaving off thin curls, making nothing in particular, just keeping his hands occupied. Sometimes he would simply sit, listening to the sounds around him. There was the constant murmur of the sheep, the rustle of leaves in the hedgerow when the wind picked up, the distant call of a crow from the forest edge. Occasionally, a voice would carry across the fields, someone calling to someone else, the words indistinct, but the tone clear. The village was close enough that its sounds were part of the background, but far enough that they didn't intrude. Thomas knew the behavior of sheep as well as he knew anything. He understood that they would always try to stay together, that separation from the flock made them nervous and skittish. He knew they would follow a leader, even if that leader was walking towards something dangerous. He knew they were most active in the cooler parts of the day, morning and evening, and would often rest during the heat of midday, lying down in the shade if any was available. He also knew when something was wrong. A A sheep that wasn't grazing might be ill. A sheep limping needed its hoof checked for stones or infection. A sheep that was separating itself from the flock was either about to give birth or dealing with some other problem that required attention. These small observations, made constantly, were the substance of his work. But most days, nothing was wrong. The sheep grazed, the sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted and lengthened. Thomas moved with them, following the flock as it drifted across the meadow, never letting them get too far from his sight, never interfering unless necessary. At midday, he might eat again, more bread, perhaps an apple if it was the right season. He carried a leather bottle of ale, weak and slightly sour, which he sipped throughout the day. Water from the stream was available, but ale was safer and more nourishing. He would pour a little into his wooden cup, drink it down, and continue watching. The afternoon was much like the morning. The sheep continued their endless cycle of grazing, moving, grazing again. Thomas continued his endless cycle of watching, walking, observing. There was a meditative quality to it, this constant, low-level attention that required no intense focus but could not be completely abandoned. He thought about many things while standing in that field. He thought about the coming harvest, whether it would be good or poor. He thought about his family, his wife at home preparing their evening meal, his son learning the blacksmith's trade in the village. He thought about repairs that needed to be made to his cottage, the thatch that was growing thin in one corner and would need replacing before winter. But mostly, he didn't think about much at all. He simply existed in that space with the sheep, under the sky as he had done for decades, and would continue to do for as long as his body allowed. This was the foundation of the wool production, the quiet, patient tending of animals. There was skill here, certainly. Thomas knew which pastures had the best grass at which times of year. He could spot signs of illness before they became serious. He understood the behavior of sheep, their needs, their patterns. But it was not exciting work. It was steady work, predictable work, the kind of work that filled long hours with simple observation and small adjustments. The kind of work that required no urgency but could not be neglected. As evening approached, the light would take on a golden quality, slanting across the meadow, making the sheep's wool glow slightly. This was the signal to begin moving them back toward the village, toward the pen where they would spend the night. Thomas would use his staff to gently guide them, moving around the edges of the flock, encouraging them in the right direction. The sheep would comply without much resistance. This was their routine. They knew the way. Thomas simply ensured they all went together, that none lagged behind or tried to wander off. The walk back was slow, punctuated by frequent stops as sheep paused to grab one more mouthful of grass. Thomas didn't hurry them. They would arrive when they arrived. At the pen, he would count them as they entered, not formally, but with the same quick assessment he used throughout the day. All present. None injured that he could see. Good enough. He would secure the gate, check the water trough, and then head home himself, his day's work complete. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, until shearing season arrived, and the routine would shift slightly, incorporating new tasks into the familiar pattern. But that was still weeks away. For now, there was just this: sheep grazing, Thomas watching, the sun moving across the sky, The slow accumulation of wool on the backs of animals who knew nothing of markets or wealth, who simply lived their sheep lives, eating and resting and growing their fleeces day by day. When late spring arrived and the weather had warmed sufficiently, the time came for shearing. This was marked not by a calendar date, which most villagers couldn't read anyway, but by observation. When the wool had grown thick enough, when the weather was consistently warm enough that newly shorn sheep wouldn't suffer from cold, when the busiest parts of spring planting were complete and hands were available for the work, then it was time. The decision was made collectively, discussed among the men who owned sheep or worked with them. Thomas mentioned to his neighbor that the fleeces were looking heavy. The neighbor agreed. Word spread. Within a day or two, everyone knew that shearing would begin on the following Monday. Assuming no rain, Monday arrived clear and bright, the kind of spring day when the world seems freshly washed and full of promise. By mid-morning, Thomas and several other men had gathered their sheep into a large pen near the center of the village. This pen was used only a few times a year, for shearing and for autumn slaughter, so it had a somewhat temporary quality despite being a solid structure. The fencing was made from woven hazel branches, creating a barrier that was flexible but strong. The sheep, finding themselves in closer quarters than usual and surrounded by more activity than they were accustomed to, moved restlessly within the pen. They milled about, bleating more frequently, pressing against each other. Their nervousness was palpable but not panicked. They simply knew something unusual was happening. Shearing required specific tools and skill. The shears themselves were substantial implements, hand-forged by the village blacksmith to a pattern that had been used for generations. Each pair consisted of 2 blades, joined at one end by a curved spring mechanism that held them together. The blades were about 6 inches long, not particularly sharp by the standards of knives or razors, but effective for their purpose when used with the right technique and sufficient force. A shearer named William sat on a low wooden stool, worn smooth from years of use. His stool had 3 legs, which made it stable even on uneven ground, and was short enough that when seated, his knees were bent at an angle that allowed him to grip a sheep securely. This was important. Shearing required control of the animal, and while sheep were not particularly large or strong, they could be remarkably uncooperative if given the chance. Thomas brought the first sheep to William, guiding it out of the pen and positioning it near the stool. William reached out, grasped the sheep firmly but not roughly, and maneuvered it into position between his legs. The sheep initially resisted, trying to pull away, but William's grip was sure. He had been shearing sheep since he was a boy, learning from his father, and his body knew the movements without conscious thought. With the sheep secured, William picked up his shears. He began at the belly, which was generally easier than the back, and allowed him to establish his rhythm before tackling the more challenging areas. The shears made a distinctive sound as they cut through the wool, a sort of grinding crunch that was audible even over the bleating of the other sheep in the pen. Each cut removed a strip of wool perhaps 2 inches wide, and William worked in long steady strokes, not trying to rush. The key to good shearing was maintaining consistent pressure and cutting close to the skin without actually cutting the skin itself. Too far from the skin, and you left too much wool on the animal, wasting valuable fiber. Too close, and you risked cuts that would bleed and potentially become infected. William judged the distance by feel. the shears riding smoothly over the contours of the sheep's body, following the muscles and bones beneath the wool. As he worked, the fleece began to come away in sections. The wool from the belly hung loosely, but as William moved to the sides and back, the fleece maintained more coherence, held together by the natural crimp and entanglement of the fibers and by the lanolin that permeated it. This was ideal. A fleece that came away in one large piece, or at least a few large sections, was easier to handle and process than one cut into many small bits. The sheep, once William had established his control and rhythm, generally held still. They might shift occasionally or turn their head to look at what was happening, but there was no violent resistance. It was as if they understood, on some level, that resistance was futile and that submission would make the experience end more quickly. Or perhaps they simply entered a state of resignation, waiting for it to be over. The sound of shearing created a background rhythm for the morning, the crunch and scrape of shears through wool. William's occasional grunt of effort when dealing with a particularly thick section. The bleating of sheep in the pen, some loud and insistent, others soft and almost questioning. The murmur of conversation between the men who waited their turn or stood watching, commenting on the quality of the fleeces or discussing other village matters. Each sheep took time, not hours, but certainly not minutes. Perhaps a quarter of an hour for an average sheep. Longer if the wool was particularly thick, or the sheep particularly uncooperative. William maintained his steady pace regardless. Rushing led to mistakes. Mistakes led to injured sheep or ruined fleece. Better to work carefully and consistently. When a sheep was finished, William would release it, and the sheep would stand for a moment, seemingly surprised to be free. Without its heavy coat, it looked smaller, more vulnerable. Its skin pale and slightly pink. The contours of its body suddenly visible in a way they hadn't been before. The sheep would shake itself, a full-body tremor that ran from head to tail, perhaps trying to adjust to the strange new feeling of being light and exposed. Then it would trot away, back toward the pen or out toward the meadow, moving with an energy that seemed surprising. Some sheep would actually skip or jump, as if celebrating their newfound lightness. By the next day, they would have adjusted to the change and returned to their normal behavior. But in those first moments after shearing, there was often a brief display of something that almost looked like joy. The fleeces themselves were gathered by other helpers, usually younger men or boys, who would collect each fleece as it came off and carry it to a large pile in one corner of a nearby barn. These fleeces were extraordinary in their oiliness. The lanolin coating them was thick and greasy, giving them a yellowish cast and a distinctive smell, earthy and animal and slightly sweet. When you touched a fresh fleece, your hands came away coated with a thin film of this oil, which was actually beneficial for the skin, but took some effort to wash off. The fleeces were not white and pristine. They were marked with dirt that had accumulated over the past year. Bits of straw and plant material that had stuck in the wool, and the inevitable staining that came from a sheep lying down in mud or manure. The wool around the hindquarters was often particularly soiled and would need the most intensive cleaning later. But even the dirtiest fleece was valuable. Wool was wool, and with proper processing, even the coarsest, dirtiest fiber could be transformed into something useful. The work continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Sheep after sheep was brought to William, shorn and released. Other men took turns at shearing when William needed to rest his hands and arms, which grew tired from the repetitive motion and constant pressure required to work the shears. Some men were faster than William, some slower. Some left smoother results, some rougher. But all worked with the same basic competence born of years of practice. By late afternoon, the pen was nearly empty. The last few sheep, perhaps sensing their fate, seemed more reluctant than the earlier ones had been, but they were caught and shorn nonetheless. The pile of fleeces had grown into a substantial heap, representing the year's growth from 60 animals. This wool would supply the village's needs for thread and cloth, with perhaps a surplus to sell at market. The newly shorn sheep were turned out into the meadow where they would spend the night. Without their heavy coats, they looked oddly uniform, just pale shapes moving across the grass in the evening light. By tomorrow they would begin their cycle again, growing new fleeces that would be thick and heavy by this time next year. The fleeces sat in the barn, waiting. They would rest there for a few days, indeed, before the work of processing them began. For now, they were simply raw material, potential rather than product. Wool that would need to be transformed through many stages before it could fulfill its purpose. But that transformation would come. It always did. As it had for centuries. As it would for centuries more. The work would continue, patient and persistent, one step following another in the eternal progression from sheep to cloth. Several days after shearing, when the immediate press of other work had eased slightly, the fleeces were brought out for the next phase of processing. This work fell primarily to women, though younger children might help with simpler tasks. And it began with sorting. Agnes, a woman in her 40s, who had worked with wool since childhood, sat in the doorway of her cottage with 3 fleeces spread before her on the packed earth of the yard. The sun was not yet high, and the air retained some of the night's coolness, which made the work more comfortable. By afternoon, it would be too warm to sit in direct sunlight. But for now, the morning light was perfect for seeing the subtle variations in the wool. Each fleece was a complete coat, or nearly so, taken from one animal. But within that single fleece was remarkable variation in quality. The wool from different parts of the sheep's body had different characteristics, and Agnes's task was to separate these different grades so that each could be used appropriately. She began with the back and shoulders, where the finest wool grew. This wool was relatively soft, with a good length of fiber and minimal contamination. She ran her fingers through it, feeling the crimp, the natural wave that gave wool its springiness and warmth. This was the wool that would be used for garments worn directly against the skin, for stockings and undergarments, for anything where comfort mattered more than durability. Working methodically, Agnes pulled apart the fleece, creating a pile of this finer wool. Her movements were efficient, but not rushed. She had done this thousands of times and would do it thousands more. Her hands knew the feel of good wool, could detect variations in texture that her eyes might miss. She worked by touch as much as by sight, her fingers running through the fleece, assessing, separating. Next came the wool from the sides and upper legs. This was slightly coarser than the back wool, but still of good quality. It would make excellent thread for outer garments, for tunics and cloaks, for anything that needed to be sturdy and weather-resistant. Agnes created a second pile for this grade. The wool from the belly and lower legs was coarser still and often more contaminated with debris. Sheep lay down frequently, and the wool on their underside picked up everything from the ground: mud, bits of straw, seeds from various plants, sometimes even small stones that had somehow become entangled. This wool would be used for items that needed durability more than softness, for blankets and rough coverings, for saddle blankets and the like. Finally, there was the wool from around the hindquarters and tail. This was the least desirable wool, often heavily soiled and matted. It was still usable, but it required the most intensive cleaning and was generally reserved for the most utilitarian purposes, perhaps even just for felting into thick, water-resistant material for outer cloaks or floor coverings. As Agnes worked, she occasionally pulled out debris she encountered. A large twig would be removed and set aside. A particularly large clump of dirt might be shaken loose. But she didn't attempt comprehensive cleaning at this stage. That would come later. For now, the goal was simply to sort the wool by quality. Her daughter Date, a girl of perhaps 12 named Emma, sat nearby working on a fourth fleece. Emma was learning the trade, as Agnes had learned from her own mother. The knowledge was passed this way, not through formal instruction, but through observation and practice, through years of sitting beside someone who knew, watching, helping, gradually taking on more of the work until you could do it yourself without thinking. Emma worked more slowly than her mother, still learning to judge the feel of different grades of wool, still building the mental map of which parts of the fleece came from which parts of the sheep. Occasionally, she would hold up a section of wool, uncertain, and Agnes would glance over, feel it briefly, and indicate which pile it should join. No words were necessary. The communication happened through gesture and understanding. The sorting took hours. A single fleece might take 30 minutes or more to properly separate, and there were dozens of fleeces to process. But there was no deadline, no rush. The fleeces would be sorted when they were sorted. Agnes and Emma worked through the morning, pausing occasionally to stretch or drink from a cup of weak ale, or simply rest their eyes. By midday, when the sun was high and the heat was becoming uncomfortable, they gathered up their sorted wool and moved it inside, into the cooler dimness of the cottage. The piles of different grades were kept separate, arranged along one wall. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, the cleaning would begin. Cleaning wool was perhaps the most tedious part of the entire process. The wool was dirty, greasy, filled with lanolin and the accumulated debris of a year spent outdoors. It needed to be cleaned thoroughly, but the cleaning itself was time-consuming and physically demanding. Agnes began with the finest wool, wanting to get the best results with the best material. She had several large wooden tubs, each about 2 feet across and a foot deep, which she used for washing. These tubs had been made by the village cooper years ago and were starting to show their age, one of them having developed a slow leak that required constant attention. But they still served their purpose. She filled the first tub with water drawn from the village well, buckets carried by Emma in multiple trips. The water was cold, which was fine for the first rinse. Later washings might be done with warm water if she felt it necessary, and if firewood could be spared, but cold water would suffice to begin. Agnes took a portion of the sorted wool, perhaps 2 handfuls, and submerged it in the water. Immediately, the water began to cloud, turning slightly brownish as dirt suspended in the lanolin began to release. She let the wool soak, pressing it down occasionally to ensure it was fully saturated, working the water through the fibers with her hands. The key to washing wool was patience. You couldn't rush it. The dirt and grease needed time to loosen, time to be drawn out by the water. Aggressive scrubbing could damage the fibers, could cause them to mat together into felt, which would ruin the wool for spinning. So Agnes worked gently, pressing and squeezing, lifting the wool from the water and then submerging it again, allowing the water to do most of the work. After perhaps 10 minutes of soaking and gentle agitation, she lifted the wool from the water and squeezed it, not wringing harshly, but pressing firmly to remove the dirty water. The water that ran off was brown and cloudy, carrying away the first layer of dirt. She set the wool aside and reached for another portion, repeating the process. When all the wool had been through the first washing, the water in the tub was thoroughly dirty, a murky brown that looked almost like thin mud. Agnes tipped the tub carefully, pouring the water out onto the ground well away from the cottage door, where it would soak into the soil. The tub needed to be refilled, and the process would begin again. The second washing was much like the first, but the water didn't become quite as dirty. The third washing cleaner still. Agnes judged by eye when the wool was clean enough. There was no point in trying to make it perfectly clean, as that was impossible with the tools available. The goal was simply to remove most of the dirt and excess grease, leaving the wool manageable for the next stages of processing. The cleaned wool was spread out to dry on grass in a sunny part of the yard, or on wooden racks if the grass was too damp. It needed to be fully dry before carding could begin. In good weather, this might take a day. In damp or cloudy weather, it could take 3 or 4 days. Agnes simply waited, checking the wool occasionally, turning it if necessary to ensure even drying. While the wool dried, Agnes and Emma would begin sorting and washing the next batch. This rhythm continued for days, even weeks, depending on how many fleeces needed processing. It was monotonous work, repetitive to the point of tedium. Fill the tub, wash the wool, squeeze it out, spread it to dry. Again and again. The same motions, the same processes, yielding the same results. But it was necessary work, and Agnes took a certain satisfaction in seeing the piles of clean dried wool growing slowly larger. Each finished batch was progress, one more step in the long transformation from fleece to fabric. The wool didn't care how long it took. It would wait, patient as stone, until Agnes was ready for the next step. When the wool was finally clean and thoroughly dry, it still bore little resemblance to the neat skeins of yarn you might imagine. It was a mass of tangled, kinked fibers, compressed from being packed in the fleece, crimped from their natural structure, and generally chaotic in their arrangement. Before this wool could be spun into thread, all these fibers needed to be aligned, straightened, and separated. This process was called carding, and it was foundational to creating quality yarn. Agnes sat in her cottage doorway on a warm afternoon, positioning herself to catch the best light. The door opened to the south, and at this time of day, sunlight streamed in at an angle that illuminated her work area perfectly. This was important, as carding required you to see what you were doing, to judge when the fibers were properly aligned. On her lap rested 2 wooden paddles, each about the size of a large hand, perhaps 8 inches long and 5 inches wide. These were her cards, and they represented a significant investment for a household of modest means. Each paddle had a handle on one side for gripping, and the face was covered with a piece of leather into which hundreds of small metal wires had been set, all angled in the same direction, like tiny hooks. These wire teeth were what did the actual work of separating and aligning the fibers. They caught the wool and pulled it, combing through the tangles, gradually bringing order to chaos. But the wires were expensive, requiring metal that needed to be drawn into thin, consistent gauges and then bent to the correct angle. A cooper in the next village over made cards, trading them or selling them for amounts that represented weeks of other labor. Not every household could afford such tools. Poorer families might use teasel heads instead, the dried seed heads of the teasel plant, which had natural hooks that served a similar function. These worked well enough but were less efficient and wore out more quickly. Agnes cards, carefully maintained and occasionally taken to the cooper for rewiring when too many teeth bent or broke, had lasted for 15 years and would probably last 15 more if she continued to care for them properly. She began by taking a small amount of wool from the basket beside her, perhaps the amount that would fit in a closed fist. This wool was clean and dry, but still tangled, and she pulled it apart slightly with her fingers, loosening it just enough to make it manageable. She laid this portion of the wool on one of the cards, spreading it across the wire teeth. The wool caught on the teeth, held in place by their hooks. Then, taking the second card in her right hand, she brought it down against the first card, pressing gently so that the teeth of both cards engaged with the wool between them. Now, the actual carding began. Agnes pulled the right-hand card upward and across the face of the left-hand card, the teeth of each card pulling through the wool in opposite directions. This was the motion that separated the fibers, that began to align them, that gradually transformed the tangled mass into organized fluff. The sound was distinctive, a soft scratching that was somehow both rhythmic and random. The metal teeth scraped across each other with each stroke, not harshly but persistently. It was a sound that Agnes had heard for so many hours of her life that it had become almost soothing, an indicator that work was progressing, that fibers were aligning. She repeated the motion. Pull the right card across the left, reset, pull again. With each stroke, more wool transferred from the left card to the right, and each time it transferred, the fibers became a little more aligned. It was gradual, incremental. You couldn't force it. You had to let the process unfold at its own pace, allowing the tools to do what they were designed to do. After perhaps 8 or 10 strokes, most of the wool had migrated to the right-hand card. Agnes now reversed the process, using the left-hand card to pull the wool back, carding it again from a different angle. This back and forth continued, wool moving from card to card, becoming fluffier and more organized with each transfer. Agnes worked with a rhythm she didn't need to think about. Her hands knew the angle, the pressure, the timing. She could look out the door at the village lane while her hands continued their work. Though she generally didn't. It was better to watch the wool, to see how it was progressing, to judge when it was ready for the next step. The goal was to create a thin, even layer of fiber on one of the cards, with all the fibers more or less parallel to each other. This took time. Rushing the process left you with incompletely carded wool, where some fibers remained kinked or tangled. Such wool would create weak, uneven thread. Better to work thoroughly, patiently, until the wool achieved the right consistency. When Agnes judged the wool ready, she carefully removed it from the card. She used her fingers to peel away the edge, then rolled it gently, creating a loose, fluffy cylinder perhaps 6 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. This was called a rolag, and it was the basic unit she would work with when spinning. She set the finished rolag aside in another basket and reached for more raw wool, beginning the process again. Card, transfer, remove, roll, again and again, each rolag taking perhaps 3 to 5 minutes to prepare. A skilled carder might produce 30 or 40 rolags in an hour of steady work, though the pace varied depending on the quality of the wool and the desired fineness of the carding. Her daughter Emma sat nearby, doing the same work with her own smaller cards. Emma's cards were sized for younger hands, and she worked more slowly than her mother, still building the muscle memory and judgment that would eventually make the work automatic. Sometimes she would look over at Agnes's hands, checking her own technique against her mother's, making small adjustments. They worked in companionable silence, broken occasionally by small observations. Agnes might comment on the quality of a particular section of wool, noting that it was especially fine or that it contained more debris than usual. Emma might ask a question about technique, wondering if she was applying the right amount of pressure. These brief exchanges punctuated the work, but didn't dominate it. Mostly there was just the sound of the cards, the soft scratching that marked progress. The afternoon wore on. The pile of raw wool in one basket slowly diminished, while the pile of rolags in another basket slowly grew. The sun moved across the sky, changing the angle of light coming through the door. Agnes shifted her position slightly to maintain good visibility. Emma stood and stretched, working out stiffness in her back and shoulders, then returned to her place and resumed carding. This work would continue for days. One fleece, when fully carded, might produce several hundred rolags. Multiple fleeces needed processing. So Agnes and Emma carded, day after day, working through the stockpile of clean wool, converting it into a form that could be spun. Other women in the village did the same, each household processing its share of the wool, contributing to the collective labor that would eventually clothe everyone. There was something meditative about carding, despite its repetitive nature. Or perhaps because of its repetitive nature. The work required just enough attention that your mind couldn't completely wander, but not so much that you had to concentrate intensely. You found yourself in a sort of middle state, aware, but not actively thinking. Your hands doing their work, while your consciousness floated along beside it. Agnes sometimes found herself remembering other times she had carded wool, years ago when Emma was just a baby, and Agnes had worked while the child slept beside her. She remembered learning to card as a child herself, sitting beside her own mother, watching those practiced hands move and trying to mimic the motion. She thought ahead to when Emma would be grown, and perhaps teaching her own daughters this same skill, the knowledge passing forward through generations in an unbroken chain of patient work. But mostly, she didn't think about much at all. She just carded stroke after stroke, rolag after rolag. The pile of finished work growing slowly, steadily. Like grass growing or stones wearing smooth in a stream. It would be done when it was done. Until then, there was just the work, and the sound of the cards, and the afternoon light shifting gradually across the cottage floor. With a growing collection of rolags prepared, Agnes was ready to begin the transformation that would finally convert loose fiber into continuous thread. This was spinning, and it was perhaps the most skilled of all wool-working tasks, requiring coordination, rhythm, and an intuitive feel for the fiber that came only from years of practice. The tool for this work was elegantly simple. A drop spindle, consisting of a wooden shaft about 12 inches long with a circular weight, called a whirl, attached near the bottom. That was all, a stick and a weight. Yet this simple device, essentially unchanged for thousands of years, was capable of creating thread of a remarkable consistency and strength. Agnes's spindle had been made by her father when she was a girl, carved from a straight piece of ash wood he had selected specifically for the purpose. The wall was made from stone, a flat disc of river rock, about 3 inches across that he had shaped and drilled through the center to accept the shaft. The weight of the wall needed to be just right, heavy enough to maintain momentum, but not so heavy that it pulled too hard on the forming thread. This one was perfect, balanced through trial and error over many uses, now so familiar to Agnes that she could probably spin in complete darkness using this spindle alone. She sat comfortably on her usual stool, positioned in good light, the basket of rowlogs within easy reach beside her. From the top of her spindle hung a leader thread, a short length of already spun yarn that served as the starting point for new work. This leader was tied permanently to the spindle, and Agnes kept it ready, wound around the shaft when not in use, easily unfurled when needed. She took a rowlog in her left hand, holding it lightly between thumb and fingers. With her right hand, she drew out a small amount of fiber from the end of the rowlog, just a tuft, and twisted it together with the end of the leader thread. The two fibers, twisted together, became one continuous strand. Now, the spinning could begin. Agnes held the junction point, where the rowlog joined the leader, with her left hand maintaining control. With her right hand, she gave the spindle a quick, practiced twist, like spinning a top, and released it. The spindle dropped, suspended by the leader thread, rotating rapidly, its momentum adding twist to the fiber. As the spindle spun, Agnes carefully drew out more fiber from the rowlog with her left hand, feeding it into the forming thread. The twist from the spinning spindle traveled up into this new fiber, converting the loose fluff into thin, strong yarn. The critical skill was in maintaining the right balance, drawing out fiber at the same rate that twist was being added, keeping the thickness consistent, the tension appropriate. Too much twist and not enough fiber, and the thread became thin and overly tight, prone to kinking and difficult to work with later. Not enough twist and too much fiber, and the thread was thick and weak, likely to pull apart under stress. The perfect thread had just the right amount of twist to hold the fibers securely together, while remaining supple and strong. Agnes's hands worked with automatic precision, the result of countless hours of practice. Her left hand held the rowlog and controlled the draw, pulling out fiber in a steady stream. Her right hand occasionally reached down to set the spindle spinning again when its momentum flagged, maintaining the constant rotation that added twist. The motion was fluid, continuous, almost hypnotic in its consistency. The sound was minimal but distinct, the whisper of fibers sliding past each other as they were drawn from the rowlog, the soft whoosh of the spindle spinning through the air, occasionally a faint creak when Agnes adjusted her grip on the forming thread. It was quiet work, the kind that could be done while talking with others, though Agnes generally preferred to work in silence, finding conversation disruptive to the rhythm. When the spindle had nearly reached the floor, When she had created perhaps an arm's length of new thread, Agnes stopped. She caught the spindle before it touched the ground, preventing the thread from slackening. Then she wound the newly created thread onto the spindle shaft, wrapping it neatly in a spiral pattern, building up a cone of yarn. With the new thread secured, she adjusted the leader, making sure there was enough length to work with, and began again. Spin the spindle, draw out fiber, let the twist run into the forming thread. Catch the spindle, wind the thread, begin again. The cycle repeated endlessly, each iteration adding more thread to the growing cone on the spindle. A single rowleg might produce several yards of thread, depending on how finely Agnes spun it. She could create very thin thread if desired, though this took longer and required more careful attention. Or she could spin thicker thread, which worked up faster, but was appropriate only for certain purposes. The thread she made now was medium weight, suitable for general weaving, neither too fine nor too coarse. The work settled into a rhythm that seemed to exist outside normal time. There was the cycle of the spindle, dropping and spinning, being wound and reset. There was the gradual diminishing of the rag in her hand as its fibers were drawn out and converted to thread. There was the slow growth of the cone of yarn on the spindle shaft, layer upon layer of thread accumulating. Agnes could spin for hours without growing bored, her hands working, her mind free to wander or rest as it pleased. Sometimes she would think about the thread itself, imagining what it might become. A piece of cloth, a garment, something useful and lasting. Sometimes she would think about nothing in particular, existing in a state of simple presence, aware of the work, but not actively directing it consciously. Emma worked at her own spinning nearby, using a smaller spindle more suited to her strength and skill level. Her thread was less even than her mother's, sometimes thicker, sometimes thinner, but it was serviceable, and her consistency was improving with each rowlag she spun. Learning to spin was not something that could be taught with words. You simply had to do it, again and again, until your hands understood what your mind could not explain. The afternoon passed. The basket of rowlags gradually emptied. The cone of yarn on Agnes's spindle grew larger and heavier, until the spindle itself became unwieldy to work with. When this happened, Agnes would remove the spun yarn from the spindle, winding it into a ball, and begin again with an empty shaft. These balls of yarn accumulated in another basket, each one representing hours of work, the slow transformation of raw wool into a form that could finally be woven into cloth. Agnes kept different weights and qualities of yarn in separate baskets, knowing from experience what each was best suited for, planning ahead for the weaving that would come later. Sometimes other tasks would interrupt the spinning. A meal needed to be prepared. The chickens needed to be fed. Some other household duty demanded attention. Agnes would set her work aside, attend to these other needs, and return to her spinning when time allowed. The work was patient. The rowlags would wait. The thread was created 1 yard at a time, and rushing would not make it appear any faster. In the evening, as the light began to fail, Agnes would continue working as long as she could see. The familiar feel of the spindle in her hand, the pull of the thread, the whisper of drawing fibers, these were all things she could do by touch as much as sight. But when it became truly dark and she could no longer judge the thickness of her thread accurately, she was to wind the day's work into its ball and set everything aside. Tomorrow she would spin more, and the day after that. The work of a single fleece, from raw wool to spun yarn, might take several weeks when combined with all the other demands of daily life. But gradually, persistently, the work progressed. Basket after basket of raw wool became basket after basket of yarn, ready for the next and final transformation. Weaving. Before thread was woven into cloth, there was often the question of colour. Not all cloth was dyed, of course. Much of the fabric worn by ordinary people remained the natural shades of the sheep from which it came: cream, grey, brown, or somewhere in between. These natural colours were perfectly serviceable and required no additional work or expense. But some thread would be dyed, creating the colours that added variety and distinction to medieval clothing, that marked special garments, that allowed for patterns and decorative touches in woven cloth. Dyeing was a specialized skill, though most households understood the basics of creating simple colors from readily available materials. For more sophisticated dyes and more consistent results, people turned to a dyer, someone who had devoted years to understanding the peculiar chemistry of color. Let us follow a dyer named Robert, who worked in a town a day's walk from Ashworth. His workshop was larger than a typical cottage, but not grand. A simple wooden structure with walls that were more gap than solid, allowing smoke and steam to escape. The building was situated downwind from the main settlement, as the smells associated with dyeing were strong and not always pleasant, particularly during certain stages of the process. The workshop's interior was dominated by several large iron pots, each suspended over its own fire pit by an arrangement of iron hooks and chains. These pots were Robert's most valuable possessions after his house itself, each one representing a significant investment in metal. They were battered from years of use, stained with layers of different dyes, but still fundamentally sound, still capable of holding water and withstanding heat. Around the workshop were arranged various baskets, barrels, and clay pots containing dyestuffs in different stages of preparation. Some held dried plants, carefully harvested and stored. Others contained powders ground from roots or bark. Still others held liquids, mordants, and preparations that Robert had mixed days or weeks earlier, allowing them to age and develop the properties he needed. Robert had learned his trade from his father, who had learned from his father, 3 generations of dyers accumulating knowledge through experiment and observation. They knew which plants produced which colors, which combinations created new hues, which treatments made colors fast, and which left them prone to fading. This knowledge was not written down in books, which Robert could not read in any case, but carried in memory and passed through demonstration. For blue, the most requested color after the natural undyed shades, Robert used woad. This plant grew locally in fields specifically cultivated for the purpose, and its processing began long before the dye pot itself. The leaves were harvested in summer, crushed in a mill to extract their juice, and then formed into balls that were left to dry and ferment. This fermentation was critical, a bacterial process that converted compounds in the plant into the chemicals that would actually create blue dye. The fermented woad balls, hard and dark and pungent, were Robert's stock in trade. He purchased them from farmers who grew woad, storing them carefully in a dry place until needed. To prepare a dye bath, he would take several of these balls, break them apart, and add them to water in one of his large pots, along with wood ash and sometimes urine, both of which created the alkaline conditions necessary for the dyeing process. This mixture needed to be heated, but carefully. Too much heat would destroy the delicate chemistry of the dye. Robert judged temperature by experience, holding his hand near the pot, occasionally dipping a finger briefly into the water to gauge its warmth. The bath should be hot, distinctly warm to the touch, but not painful, certainly not boiling. He maintained this temperature for hours, adding wood to the fire as needed, allowing the woad to fully dissolve and the dye bath to mature. While the dye bath prepared, Robert wound the yarn he intended to dye into loose skeins. This wool came from Agnes and other spinners in Ashworth and surrounding villages, purchased or received in trade for the dyed yarn he would return. The skeins needed to be tied loosely in several places so they could be handled easily without tangling, but not so tightly that dye couldn't penetrate evenly throughout the yarn. He also needed to prepare the yarn for dyeing through a process called mordanting, treating it with substances that would help the dye bond permanently to the fibers. For woad, the mordant was simple, sometimes just a washing in clean water, sometimes a treatment with alumine, a mineral salt that Robert purchased from traveling merchants. The yarn was soaked in this mordant solution, squeezed gently and left to rest while the dye bath continued its preparation. When everything was ready, when the dye bath had steeped for several hours and the yarn had been properly prepared, Robert began the actual dyeing. He lifted a skein of yarn and carefully lowered it into the murky liquid of the dye pot, using a long wooden pole to submerge it completely, ensuring no part of the yarn remained above the surface. Then came waiting. The yarn needed to soak, to absorb the dye solution, to give the color time to penetrate each fiber. How long depended on many factors: the strength of the dye bath, the weight of the yarn, the depth of color desired. Robert judged this through experience and through periodic checks, using his haul to lift a small portion of the skein from the bath, examining its color in the light. While the yarn soaked, Robert tended to other tasks. He might prepare another dye bath in a different pot, working on a different color for different yarn. He might wind finished dyed yarn onto bobbins for easier handling. He might simply sit on a stool near the workshop door, eating bread and cheese, drinking ale, watching smoke rise from his fire pits and drift away on the breeze. There was no point in standing over the dye pot. The process worked at its own pace. Staring at it would not make it faster. So Robert learned patience early in his training, learned to judge when attention was needed and when it was better to simply let time pass. When sufficient time had elapsed, perhaps an hour for a light tint or several hours for a deep saturated color, Robert lifted the yarn from the bath. It emerged dripping with excess liquid, a peculiar yellow-green color that looked nothing like blue. This was expected, normal, part of the particular chemistry of woad dye. He let the skein drain briefly, then carried it outside and hung it on wooden racks that stood in the open air. As the yarn hung there, exposed to oxygen, a remarkable transformation occurred. Slowly, gradually, the yellow-green faded and shifted, becoming first a greenish blue, then a purer blue, the color deepening and clarifying over the course of several minutes. This oxidation process was one of the marvels of dyeing, this visible transformation that happened simply through contact with air. Robert had seen it thousands of times, but still found it satisfying. This moment when the yarn revealed its true color, when the work showed its results. The yarn might need multiple dippings in the dye bath to achieve a deeper shade. Robert would let the first dyeing oxidize fully, then return the yarn to the pot for another soaking. Then hang it again for another oxidation. Each cycle added more color, building up layers of blue until the yarn reached the shade he desired. Other colors required different plants and different processes. For red, Robert used madder root, which needed to be dried and ground into powder before use. This powder was added to water with a mordant, usually alum, and heated carefully. The yarn was added to this bath and simmered gently for an extended period, sometimes an hour or more, to extract the full depth of color. Madder could produce a range of shades from pale pink to deep brick red, depending on the amount of dye stuff used, the type and amount of mordant, the temperature of the bath, and the length of time the yarn soaked. Robert knew all these variables through experience, could adjust his process to achieve specific results, though there was always some variation, some unpredictability in the outcome. Yellow came from several sources. Weld, a plant that grew wild in many places, produced a bright, clear yellow. Onion skins, saved and dried, gave a warmer, more golden hue. Various flowers and plant materials could contribute different shades of yellow and orange. These dyes were generally easier to work with than blue or red, requiring less elaborate preparation and often needing no mordant or only a simple one. For browns and blacks, Robert used oak galls, the round growths that formed on oak trees in response to insect larvae. These galls were rich in tannins, which produced brown colors naturally and could be darkened to near black, with the addition of iron, either in the form of rusty nails added to the dye pot or through a separate treatment in an iron solution after the initial dyeing. Each color had its season and its requirements. Some dye stuffs were available only at certain times of year and needed to be gathered and prepared when ready. Others, like dried madder root or fermented woad balls, could be stored and used throughout the year. Robert planned his work around these cycles, dyeing certain colors when their materials were available, storing the dyed yarn for later use or immediate sale. After dyeing, regardless of color, the yarn needed to be rinsed thoroughly to remove excess dye and any chemicals used in the process. Robert would take the dyed skeins to a stream that ran near his workshop, submerging them in the cold, clear water, squeezing and swishing them until the water ran clean. This rinsing was important, as unremoved dye could stain hands or fabric during weaving, and residual mordant could weaken the fibers over time. The rinsed yarn was then hung to dry, draped over racks or ropes in the open air, where sun and wind would work together to dry it completely. The drying might take a day in good weather, longer if conditions were damp. Robert would check the yarn periodically, feeling it to judge its moisture level, bringing it inside if rain threatened, putting it back out when the weather cleared. When fully dry, the dyed yarn was ready to return to those who had supplied the raw thread. Robert would wind it into neat skeins or balls, keeping careful track of which wool came from which household, ensuring that each person received back yarn of equivalent weight to what they had supplied, minus a small amount that Robert kept as payment for his work and materials. The dyed yarn was a transformation. The same thread that had been plain and undistinguished, now colored and special, ready to be woven into cloth that would brighten a room or distinguish a garment. But like every other step in the long journey from sheep to fabric, dyeing required patience, required waiting for processes to complete in their own time, required understanding that rushing would yield inferior results. Robert's hands were permanently stained with his work, his fingers marked with blue and red and brown, colors that had soaked into his skin and would never fully wash away. These stains were a badge of his trade, marking him as a dyer as surely as any guild sign could. He wore them without concern, accepting them as part of the craft, as inevitable as the seasons or the need for food. As evening approached and the light began to fade, Robert would damp down his fires, banking them carefully so they would be easy to restart the next morning. He would cover his dye pots to keep debris from falling in, check that his drying yarn was secure, and head home to his own cottage in the town. Tomorrow he would return and the work would continue. More yarn to dye, more colors to create, the endless patient labor of adding hue to the world one skein at a time. Now we come to what might be called the final transformation, though truly there were more steps even beyond this. Turning thread into cloth. This was accomplished on a loom, and while spinning was portable work that could be done in moments scattered throughout the day, weaving required a dedicated space and sustained, focused attention. In Ashworth, several households had looms. These were not small, portable frames, but substantial pieces of equipment that occupied significant space in a cottage, and represented both a considerable investment and a commitment to the craft of weaving. A weaver named Margaret worked at one such loom, creating cloth that would supply her family's needs and provide some surplus for trade or sale. The loom itself was a frame of oak timbers, aged and hardened, assembled with wooden pegs and joints that had been fitted and refitted over years of use. It stood perhaps 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with various bars and beams at different heights serving different functions in the weaving process. The exact design varied from loom to loom, reflecting individual preferences and regional traditions, but all operated on the same basic principles, creating 2 sets of threads, the warp and the weft, and interlacing them to form cloth. The most time-consuming part of weaving, surprisingly, was not the weaving itself, but the preparation, the setting up of the loom with the warp threads that would form the foundation of the fabric. This preparation might take as long as the actual weaving, sometimes longer, but it was essential. Poorly prepared warp threads would create cloth that was uneven, weak, prone to flaws. Margaret began this process on a cool morning in early autumn, working in the cottage with the door propped open to admit light. She had decided to create a piece of cloth approximately 5 feet wide and 10 feet long, suitable for making several garments or perhaps a large blanket. For this, she would need hundreds of individual warp threads, all carefully measured to the same length, all properly tensioned. She started by calculating how many threads she would need. The threads needed to be close enough together that the weft couldn't simply slip between them, but not so close that the cloth became stiff and board-like. For cloth of moderate weight, suitable for everyday garments, she would place perhaps 20 threads per inch across the width. For a cloth 5 feet wide, that meant 1,200 threads. 1,200 threads, all needing to be measured to a length of about 12 feet, accounting for the extra length that would be taken up in the loom's mechanism and in the finishing process. This measurement was not done with rulers or marked strings, but by wrapping thread around pegs set at a known distance apart, counting the wraps carefully. Margaret used a warping board for this task, a wooden frame about 3 feet square into which numerous pegs had been set at precise intervals. She would tie the end of her yarn to one peg, then wrap it around the pegs in a specific pattern that allowed her to measure multiple threads simultaneously while keeping them organized and preventing tangling. The work was meditative in its own way. Wrap around this peg, cross to that one, loop around it, return, again and again, building up a thick rope of threads, all the same length, all parallel. She worked steadily for hours, occasionally stopping to stretch her back or rest her eyes, but mostly maintaining a consistent rhythm. When all the threads were measured, Margaret needed to transfer them from the warping board to the loom. This required care and attention. The threads needed to stay in order, needed to maintain their parallel arrangement, needed to avoid tangling. She worked slowly, methodically, moving small groups of threads at a time, securing each group before moving the next. The back beam of the loom, a thick horizontal bar at the rear of the frame, would hold one end of the warp threads. Margaret tied the threads to this beam in small bundles, working across its width, ensuring even spacing and consistent tension. The threads stretched forward from this beam, running through various parts of the loom's mechanism toward the front beam, where they would eventually be tied off once the weaving began. But before they could be tied to the front beam, each individual thread needed to be threaded through a heddle. The heddles were loops of string, hundreds of them, suspended from two horizontal bars called shafts that could be raised and lowered independently. When one shaft was raised, it lifted every thread passing through its heddles, creating a space called a shed, through which the weft thread could pass. Threading the heddles was perhaps the most tedious part of the entire setup process. Margaret sat before the loom, her face close to the threads, working in the best light she could manage. She would take one warp thread, pass it through a heddle on the first shaft, then take the next warp thread and pass it through a heddle on the second shaft, alternating across the entire width of the warp. Each threading took only a moment, but there were 1,200 of them. The work required sustained attention, as a single misthreaded heddle could create flaws in the finished cloth that wouldn't be apparent until much later. Margaret worked for an hour, then rested her eyes. Worked for another hour, rested again. Gradually, over the course of most of a day, all the threads were properly threaded. After the heddles came the reed, a comb-like device that would help keep the warp threads evenly spaced and would be used to beat the weft threads tightly together as the weaving progressed. The reed had narrow slots, and Margaret needed to pass each warp thread through its own slot, maintaining the same spacing she had established when tying the threads to the back beam. This was another hour of careful, close work, threading each strand through its designated slot, checking and rechecking to ensure no threads were missed or doubled. By the time the reed threading was complete, the day was far advanced, and Margaret's eyes were tired from the detailed work. She would finish the setup tomorrow. The next morning, she tied the front ends of the warp threads to the front beam of the loom, working again in small bundles, ensuring even tension across the width of the threads. This tension was critical. Too loose, and the cloth would be sloppy and uneven. Too tight, and the threads might break under the stress of weaving. Margaret adjusted each bundle carefully, testing the feel with her fingers, relying on her experience to judge what was right. Finally, after nearly 2 full days of preparation, the loom was ready. The warp threads stretched from back to front, properly spaced, properly tensioned, ready to receive the weft threads that would transform them from a collection of parallel lines into integrated cloth. Margaret sat on her weaving bench, a low seat positioned before the loom at a height that let her reach the reed comfortably while keeping her feet on the treadles that controlled the shafts. She checked her setup one final time, raising and lowering the shafts with the treadles, ensuring the sheds opened properly, that no threads were caught or tangled. Satisfied, she prepared her shuttle, a smooth wooden tool about a foot long, tapered at both ends, with a cavity in the middle that held a bobbin of weft thread. The thread from this bobbin trailed from a small notch in the shuttle's side, and as the shuttle passed through the shed, it would leave a trail of thread behind it. Margaret pressed the right treadle with her foot. The right shaft rose, lifting half the warp threads. Between the raised threads and the lowered threads, a triangular space opened, the shed. Into this space, Margaret threw the shuttle with a practiced flick of her wrist. The shuttle skimmed through the shed from right to left, the weft thread trailing behind it. She caught the shuttle with her left hand and set it aside for a moment. Then she picked up the reed, which was mounted on a movable frame called a beater, and pulled it firmly forward. The reed pressed the newly laid weft thread tightly against the previous threads, compacting them together, creating the dense, integrated structure of cloth. Press the left treadle. Throw the shuttle back from left to right. Beat the thread into place. Press the right treadle. Throw the shuttle. Beat. Left treadle. Shuttle. Beat. Right treadle. Shuttle. Beat. The rhythm established itself immediately. The same rhythm weavers had followed for centuries, the fundamental pattern of creating cloth. The sound of weaving created a distinctive percussion. The soft thump of the treadles as Margaret's feet pressed them. The whisper of the shuttle sliding through the shed. The firm thunk of the beater pushing the weft into place. These sounds layered over each other, creating a rhythm that was constant, but never quite regular. As the timing varied slightly with each pass of the shuttle, Margaret worked in sessions, perhaps an hour at a time, before needing to stand and stretch, to work out the stiffness that accumulated in her back and shoulders from the repetitive motion and the hunched posture required by the work. Weaving was physically demanding in ways that weren't immediately obvious, the sustained repetitive movement taking its toll gradually rather than suddenly. During her weaving sessions, Margaret fell into a state of focused presence. Her mind was engaged with the work, but not intensely concentrating on it. Her body knew what to do, had performed these motions so many times that conscious direction was unnecessary. She could think about other things while she wove, planning meals or remembering conversations, but always part of her attention remained with the loom, monitoring the work, noticing if tension changed or if a thread began to show signs of strain. The cloth grew slowly. The first hour of work might produce 6 inches of fabric, perhaps 8 if Margaret maintained a particularly steady pace. This meant that the full 10 feet she intended would require 15 or 20 hours of actual weaving time, spread over many days, fitted in between all the other demands of daily life. As the cloth grew longer, it was wound onto the front beam of the loom, keeping the work area at a consistent height and preventing the newly woven cloth from dragging on the ground or becoming dirty. This winding happened periodically, perhaps every few feet, requiring Margaret to loosen the warp tension temporarily, roll the cloth forward, and retension before continuing. The pattern Margaret wove was the simplest possible, called plain weave or tabby, where the weft simply went over one warp thread and under the next, alternating on each pass. This created a strong, versatile fabric suitable for most everyday purposes. More complex patterns, where the weft might pass over or under multiple warp threads in specific sequences, required more complex loom setups and more attention during weaving, but resulted in decorative effects or structural variations. Days passed. Margaret wove for an hour in the morning before the day's other work demanded her attention. She wove again in the afternoon if time allowed. Perhaps in the evening by candlelight, though this was less ideal as the light was dim and the work required good visibility to catch errors before they became problems. Other members of the household moved around her as she worked. Her husband came and went, heading to the fields or returning home. Children played or did their own tasks, their noise a background to her weaving. Occasionally, someone would stop to watch for a few moments, but weaving, for all its fundamental importance, was not particularly interesting to observe. Just the same motion repeated endlessly, the cloth growing by almost imperceptible increments. This was the final major transformation in the journey from fleece to fabric. The thread that Agnes had spun, that Robert had perhaps dyed, was now being woven by Margaret into cloth, into something with structure and integrity, into material that could be cut and sewn into garments or used for any of the hundreds of purposes that fabric served. But even when the weaving was complete, the work was not quite finished. The cloth would need to be fulled to give it strength and finish. The edges would need to be secured to prevent unraveling. The surface might need treatment to raise a nap or smooth away irregularities. All of these finishing processes still lay ahead, but the fundamental substance was here, created by Margaret's patient, persistent work at the loom, one pass of the shuttle at a time. When cloth came off the loom, cut free from the warp threads that had held it in place, it was not yet finished. It was thin, somewhat open in its weave, lacking the density and strength it would need to serve its purpose. The individual threads were still distinct, visible as separate elements rather than integrated into a unified whole. To achieve its final character, the cloth needed to undergo fulling, a process that would cause the wool fibers to mat together, creating fabric that was thicker, warmer, and more durable. Fulling was physically demanding work, traditionally done by walking on the cloth in tubs of hot water, though some larger operations used water-powered fulling mills where wooden hammers pounded the cloth mechanically. In Ashworth and the surrounding area, most fulling was still done by hand and foot, using methods that had changed little in centuries. A fuller named John worked at his trade in a small building near the village mill, where access to flowing water made certain aspects of his work easier. His workspace was simple, dominated by a large wooden trough, perhaps 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, set at a comfortable height for working. This trough was old, its interior worn smooth by years of use, darkened by the accumulated stains of countless batches of cloth. John's work began with preparation. The cloth needed to be wetted thoroughly, but not with plain water. For fulling to work effectively, something was needed to help break down the residual oils in the wool and to create the right conditions for the fibers to felt together. The traditional solution, proven by generations of fullers, was urine. Urine, despite its unpleasant associations, was a valuable resource in medieval textile processing. The ammonia it contained, produced by the breakdown of urea, was effective at dissolving oils and promoting the chemical changes needed for fulling. John kept several large barrels of urine collected from households in the village and left to age and ripen, becoming more alkaline as the urea broke down. He would mix this aged urine with hot water in his fulling trough, creating a solution that was warm but not scalding, strong but not overwhelming. The proportions came from experience rather than measurement. Too much urine and the cloth might be weakened. Too little and the fulling would be incomplete. John judged by smell and by the feel of the liquid, his senses calibrated by years of practice. Margaret's cloth, fresh from the loom, was brought to John for fulling. He took the fabric, examined it briefly to assess its weight and structure, and then submerged it in the prepared solution. The cloth immediately began to absorb the liquid, growing heavier, darker, as the wool fibers swelled with moisture. Now came the work itself. John climbed into the trough, standing on the submerged cloth, and began to tread. This was not gentle walking, but vigorous, rhythmic stomping. His feet pressing and pushing the fabric, working it against the bottom of the trough, creating friction and agitation that would cause the fibers to felt together. The work was exhausting. John would stomp and tread for perhaps 30 minutes at a time before needing to rest, his legs burning from the effort, his lungs working hard to supply the oxygen his muscles demanded. The motion needed to be vigorous enough to create the felting effect, but not so violent that it damaged the cloth or wore out the fuller before the job was done. As he worked, John could feel the cloth changing under his feet. Initially, it had been relatively soft and yielding, compressing easily under his weight. But as the fulling progressed, as the fibers began to mat together, the cloth grew firmer, more resistant. This resistance was the goal, the sign that the process was working. The sound in the fulling shed was a combination of splashing water, the thump and slap of John's feet against the fabric and the bottom of the trough, and his own heavy breathing. It was not pleasant work, standing in hot, ammonia-laden water, pounding fabric with your feet for hours. But it was necessary work, and John took satisfaction in doing it well, and periodically he would stop and lift the cloth from the solution, examining it to judge how the fulling was progressing. The fabric should be thickening, the weave becoming less distinct as threads merged together. The cloth should be shrinking as well, becoming smaller in both length and width as the fibers compacted. A piece that had been 10 feet long coming from the loom might be only 8 or 9 feet when fully fulled. If the fulling was proceeding well, John would return the cloth to the solution and continue treading. If it seemed to be progressing too slowly, he might add more hot water to maintain temperature, or add more urine to strengthen the solution. If it was going too quickly, which was rare but possible, he might dilute the solution with plain water, slowing the process to prevent overfulling, which would create cloth that was too stiff and board-like. The work continued for hours. Tread and stomp, rest, examine the cloth, resume treading. John worked through the morning and into the afternoon, occasionally pausing to eat bread and drink ale, but mostly focused on the work. Other pieces of cloth waited to be fulled, but he worked on only one at a time, giving each his full attention. When the cloth had reached the right consistency, when it had thickened and shrunk to the appropriate degree, John lifted it from the fulling solution and began the rinsing process. The cloth was thoroughly saturated with the urine solution and needed to be washed clean before it could proceed to the next steps. He carried the heavy dripping fabric to the stream that ran past his workshop, the same stream that powered the village mill 100 yards away. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. John submerged the cloth in the stream, weighing it down with rocks to keep it from being carried away by the current, and let the flowing water begin its work of washing away the fulling solution. After perhaps 30 minutes, he would pull the cloth from the stream and squeeze it, forcing out water and loosening any remaining solution. Then he would return it to the stream for another soaking. This cycle repeated several times, each rinse removing more of the rinse smell and residue, until finally the cloth was clean, smelling only of wet wool and the fresh scent of stream water. The rinsed cloth was now ready for stretching and drying. John carried it, still heavy with water, to a large wooden frame that stood in an open area near his workshop. This frame, called a tenter, was covered with hooks, small metal prongs that could grip fabric, and had adjustable sides that allowed it to be expanded or contracted. John attached the edges of the cloth to the tenterhooks, working carefully to ensure even distribution of tension across the entire piece. The cloth needed to be stretched to its full dimensions, but not pulled so tightly that it became thin or distorted. He would attach one edge, then the opposite edge, then the remaining two edges, working his way around and making small adjustments to ensure the fabric hung flat and square. As the cloth dried, it would maintain whatever shape it was stretched to, so this careful adjustment was important. An ill-stretched cloth would be crooked or uneven, diminishing its value and making it more difficult to cut and sew into garments. John worked slowly, checking the hang of the fabric from different angles, making tiny adjustments to individual hooks, ensuring everything was as it should be. Once the cloth was properly stretched on the tenter, John left it to dry. This would take time, perhaps a full day in good weather, longer if the air was humid or if rain interrupted the process. During the drying, John would check on the fabric periodically, ensuring the wind hadn't pulled it loose from any hooks, that no birds had perched on it leaving droppings, that nothing had disturbed the even tension. When the fabric was nearly dry, John would take up another of his tools, a teasel frame. This was a wooden paddle to which dried teasel heads had been attached, these spiny seed pods from the teasel plant serving as natural combs. With this tool, John would gently brush the surface of the slightly damp cloth, raising a nap, bringing some fibers to the surface, and creating a softer texture. This napping was delicate work. Too aggressive, and the cloth could be damaged, fibers pulled loose or torn. Too gentle, and the effect would be minimal. John worked with light, consistent pressure, brushing the fabric in long, even strokes, watching as the surface character changed, becoming slightly fuzzy, acquiring the softer hand that made wool cloth pleasant to wear. After napping, the cloth was left to finish drying completely. When it was fully dry, John would remove it from the tenter, folding it carefully, and it would be ready to return to Margaret. The fabric had been transformed through the fulling process. It was now thicker, stronger, more resistant to wind and rain, with a surface texture that was more refined. It had become truly cloth in the full sense of the word, ready to be cut and sewn into whatever its ultimate purpose might be. John hung the finished cloth over a beam in his workshop and turned his attention to the next piece, waiting for fulling. The work continued, as it always did, one piece of cloth at a time, transformed through patient, vigorous labor into something that would serve and last. The cloth had traveled a long path, from sheep to fleece to fiber to thread to fabric. But its journey was not quite complete. To truly fulfill its purpose, this flat expanse of woolen material needed to be transformed one final time, cut and sewn into the garments that would clothe someone's body, providing warmth, protection, and a degree of comfort in a world where these things were not always assured. This work fell to those skilled with needle and thread, to people who understood how to look at a human form and imagine the shapes of cloth that could be joined to cover it. In Ashworth, a woman named Eleanor had made this her particular expertise, serving several families in the village and surrounding area as a seamstress. Eleanor worked in her cottage, though she sometimes went to the homes of her more prosperous clients when the commission required it. Her tools were simple but essential. Several needles of different sizes, made of iron and purchased at considerable expense from a peddler who passed through twice a year. Scissors, a precious possession that she guarded carefully. Thread, spun from linen, which was stronger than wool for sewing. And a few wooden or bone pins for holding fabric in place while she worked. Her current project was a simple tunic for a farmer in the village, a man named Walter, whose old tunic had worn through beyond the possibility of further mending. He had brought her a length of Margaret's cloth, fulled by John, a piece about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide in a natural grey-brown shade. From this, Eleanor would create a garment that would serve him for years if cared for properly. Medieval garments were, by and large, quite simple in their construction. The elaborate fitted fashions that would emerge in later centuries had not yet developed. A basic tunic was essentially a long T-shape, a rectangular body with rectangular sleeves attached, and a hole cut for the head. But even such simple construction required skill and judgment to produce a garment that would fit reasonably well and use the available fabric efficiently. Eleanor began by taking Walter's measurements. This was not done with measuring tapes, which did not exist in any practical form, but by eye and by using his old tunic as a reference. She noted his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the length of his arms. She considered how the garment should fit, loose enough to allow movement and to be worn over an undergarment, but not so loose that it would catch on things or waste fabric. She laid out the new cloth on her work table, a rough wooden surface that occupied much of the floor space in one half of her cottage. The cloth needed to be examined for any flaws, any thin spots or irregularities that had survived the various processing stages. Any such flaws needed to be worked around, positioned where they would not cause problems or would be less visible. Satisfied that the cloth was sound, Eleanor planned her cutting strategy. She needed to extract from this rectangular piece of fabric all the pieces required for the tunic. The front and back panels, 2 sleeves, and various smaller pieces for gussets, triangular inserts that would be added under the arms to allow greater freedom of movement. The goal was to minimize waste, to use as much of the fabric as possible, leaving only small scraps that might be saved for patches or other small projects. She had no pattern in the modern sense, no paper templates to follow. The patterns existed in her mind and in her hands, built from years of experience. She knew that a sleeve for a man of Walter's size would be roughly so long and so wide. She knew how much extra width to allow in the body panels for comfort and for the thickness of whatever he would wear underneath. Using a piece of chalk or a sliver of soap, Eleanor marked the cutting lines on the cloth. She worked slowly, checking and rechecking her measurements, visualizing how the pieces would come together. A mistake in cutting could ruin the fabric, wasting all the labor that had gone into creating it. Better to measure 3 times and cut once. When she was confident in her markings, Eleanor picked up her scissors. These were not like modern scissors, with 2 pivoting blades meeting at a point. Medieval scissors were more like large shears, with 2 blades joined at one end, and a spring mechanism that held them open unless pressed closed. They required strength to operate, and careful control to cut in straight lines. She positioned the scissors at the beginning of a cutting line and began to cut, the blades working through the fabric with a sound like paper tearing but more substantial. The cut needed to be clean and straight, no jagged edges that would be difficult to sew later. Eleanor worked carefully, following her marked lines, letting the scissors do the work without forcing them. Each cut was a small moment of irreversibility. Once made, the cut could not be undone. The cloth was divided, committed to its intended form. Eleanor was comfortable with this finality, confident in her planning, but she never approached cutting carelessly. When all the pieces were cut, Eleanor laid them out to confirm that she had everything needed, and that the pieces were the right shapes and sizes. The body panels, each a large rectangle. The sleeves, slightly tapered from shoulder to wrist. The gussets, small triangles that would be set into the corners where body and sleeves met. Everything was present. Everything looked right. Now came the sewing, the work of joining these separate pieces into an integrated garment. Eleanor began with the shoulder seams, joining the front and back body panels at their upper edges. She threaded her needle with linen thread, not too long a piece or it would tangle, and began to stitch. Her stitches were small and even, created with a practiced rhythm that came from thousands of hours of sewing. She would push the needle through both layers of fabric, pull it through, position it for the next stitch, push it through again. The spacing of the stitches was consistent, perhaps 8 or 10 to an inch, close enough to be secure, but not so close as to weaken the fabric by creating too many holes. The work progressed slowly. A seam perhaps 2 feet long might take 15 minutes to sew properly. Eleanor worked seated near the cottage's window, positioned to catch the best light. Her posture was hunched, her eyes focused on the fabric, her hands working in small and precise movements. This was quiet work. The only sounds were the whisper of thread being pulled through fabric, an occasional small exhalation from Eleanor when she paused to reposition the garment, the faint noise of the needle puncturing the weave. No music, no conversation, just concentration and the steady accumulation of stitches. After the shoulders came the side seams, joining the front and back panels from armpit to hem. These were longer seams, requiring more time, more thread. Eleanor worked steadily, maintaining her rhythm, occasionally pausing to adjust her posture or rest her eyes. When the body of the tunic was assembled, she turned her attention to the sleeves. Each sleeve needed to be sewn along its length, converting a flat rectangle into a tube. Then, these tubes needed to be set into the armholes, attached with careful stitching that would withstand the stress of arm movement. Setting sleeves was one of the more challenging aspects of garment construction. The sleeve needed to be properly oriented. The fuller part at the top where it attached to the shoulder. The narrower part at the wrist. It needed to be evenly distributed around the armhole, without puckering or bunching. Eleanor used pins to hold the sleeve in place while she sewed, checking frequently to ensure everything aligned correctly. She stitched the sleeve in place carefully, working around the entire armhole. Then she set in the triangular gussets under each arm. These reinforcements that would prevent the stress of movement from tearing the seams. Each gusset had 3 edges that needed to be sewn to 3 corresponding edges of the garment body, creating a neat insertion. The final major construction step was finishing the neckline. A simple tunic had a basic opening at the neck, just large enough to pass over the head. Eleanor sewed around this opening with small stitches, reinforcing the edge to prevent it from stretching out or fraying. With the major construction complete, Eleanor examined the garment carefully, turning it inside out to check her seams, looking for any places where stitches had been missed or where the tension was uneven. She found a few minor issues and corrected them, resewing short sections where her initial work had been less than perfect. The final step was hemming, finishing the bottom edge of the tunic and the ends of the sleeves to prevent them from unraveling. This was straightforward, but time-consuming, requiring her to fold the fabric edge under and sew it in place all around the bottom hem and around both sleeve ends. More small, even stitches, more patient work. When she was finished, Eleanor held up the completed tunic, examining her work in the light. It was a simple garment, unadorned, just plain grey-brown wool shaped into a functional piece of clothing. But it was well made, the seams straight, the stitches secure, the fit appropriate for its intended wearer. She folded the tunic carefully and set it aside for Walter to collect. Another garment completed, another piece of cloth converted into something to be worn, to keep someone warm and protected. Tomorrow or the next day, there would be another piece of fabric waiting, another garment to construct, the work continuing in its steady progression. Eleanor's hands were marked by her work, her fingers calloused from the friction of thread, her skin punctured by countless small needle pricks that had healed into barely visible dots. These marks were the signs of her craft, accumulated over years of patient sewing, of transforming cloth into clothing, one stitch at a time. On a warm summer day, a year after we began our story, Thomas the shepherd stood in the same meadow, watching the same flock of sheep. The sheep were different individuals, some from the previous year having been sold or slaughtered, new lambs having grown to take their places, but the flock as a whole was essentially unchanged. They grazed the same grass, moved across the same ground, behaved in the same ways. The wool on their backs had grown thick through the winter and springing, had protected them through cold months, and would soon be shorn away in another annual shearing. The cycle would repeat. Shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving, fulling, sewing. The same steps in the same order, performed by the same people, or by new people learning the old ways. Agnes sat in her doorway kneading wool, as she had the previous year and the year before that and the year before that. Her daughter Emma, now more skilled, worked beside her with greater speed and confidence. The baskets of wool waiting to be processed seemed no smaller, no matter how much work was completed. There was always more wool, always more work to be done. Margaret stood at her loom, the shuttle passing through the shed, the beater pushing the weft into place. This was a different piece of cloth than the one from a year ago, but the work was identical. The same motions, the same rhythm, the same slow accumulation of fabric. She would weave this piece, and when it was complete, there would be another to begin. In his workshop, Robert the dyer prepared another batch of blue dye, the woad ball steeping in hot water, the familiar pungent smell filling the air. He had dyed thousands of skeins in his years at this work, and would dye thousands more. Each one was technically unique, but practically they were all the same. Variations on familiar themes, the same colors emerging from the same materials through the same processes. John the Fuller stomped on cloth in his trough, his feet working the fabric, his breath coming heavily with the exertion. He had fulled cloth yesterday, and would full cloth tomorrow. The work never truly ended, just paused briefly between one piece and the next. His tenter stood ready, hooks waiting to receive the next piece of finished, stretched cloth. Eleanor, the seamstress, pulled thread through fabric, her needle moving in small, careful stitches. This tunic was for a different client than last year's, but the construction was effectively identical. She would finish this garment and begin another. There was always need for clothing, always fabric waiting to be cut and sewn. This continuity, this repetition, was not a burden to be endured, but simply the nature of the work. There was comfort in it, in fact, this knowing what came next, this understanding of one's role and purpose. Each person in this chain of wool working knew their tasks, performed them with competence, and took satisfaction in work done well. The wool itself went through its transformations with the same patience it had shown for centuries. It did not resist being cleaned or carded or spun or woven. It simply was what it was, responding to each process in predictable ways, converting from one form to another through human labor and craft. In the evening, as the sun set and shadows grew long across the village, work gradually ceased for the day. Sheep were penned, spinning wheels fell silent, looms stood idle, fire pits were banked, needles were set aside. The workers rested, ate their evening meals, prepared for sleep. Tomorrow, the work would resume. Thomas would watch his sheep. Agnes would card wool. Margaret would weave. Robert would dye. John would full. Eleanor would sew. The cycle would continue, as it had for generations, as it would for generations more. This was the reality of wool working in medieval England. Patient, persistent, unhurried labor that created the fabric of daily life. Not exciting, not dramatic, but essential and enduring. The quiet work that clothed a nation, one thread at a time, one garment at a time, in an endless progression that marked the passage of days and years. The wool bore witness to all of this. From the sheep's back to the human back, from raw fleece to finished garment. Through months of labor by many hands, it made its journey. And when a garment finally wore out, as all things must, the cloth might be unraveled, the thread respun into something new, the wool's utility extending beyond its first use. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. Everything happened in its time, at its pace, with the patient understanding that good work required time and attention, that shortcuts led to poor results, that the old ways persisted because they worked. As darkness fell over Ashworth, the village settled into quietness. A dog barked somewhere. A door closed. A voice called a last good night. Then silence, broken only by natural sounds. The wind in the trees. A stream flowing. An owl calling from the forest. The sheep slept in their pen in their wool growing imperceptibly, cell by cell, fiber by fiber through the night. By morning, they would be minutely hairier than they had been the evening before. By next week, measurably so. By next season, ready for another shearing. And the cycle would continue. Always had, always would. The patient transformation of wool, from sheep to fleece to fabric, through all the stages in between, performed by hands that knew the work, in a world that moved at the pace of the seasons and saw no reason to move faster. As we come to the end of our journey through the medieval wool-working process, it's worth pausing to reflect on what this labor represented, not just materially, but spiritually, culturally, in terms of human relationship to work and time and making. These were not people who hurried. They did not multitask in the way we understand it. They did not seek efficiency for its own sake, or try to compress time to extract more productivity from each hour. They worked at a human pace, a pace dictated by the capabilities of hand and eye, by the nature of the materials they worked with, by the rhythm of day and season. A single garment represented hundreds, perhaps thousands, of hours of accumulated labor. The time the sheep spent growing wool, measured in months and seasons. The hours of shearing, cleaning, carding, the days and weeks of spinning, the careful work of dyeing, the extended process of weaving, the vigorous labor of fulling, the meticulous stitching of sewing. When you put on a tunic in medieval England, you wore the accumulated labor of many hands, many days, many small, patient acts of transformation. This created a relationship with objects that is difficult for us to fully comprehend in our age of mass production and disposable everything. Things were not thrown away lightly because they represented too much invested time and effort. Clothing was mended and remended, worn until it was truly beyond repair, then unraveled and respun into something new. Every scrap of wool had value because someone had worked to create it. The wool workers themselves were not famous. Their names, when recorded at all, appear only in tax rolls or parish records, dry lists of who lived where and what they owed. Agnes and Margaret and John and Thomas and Eleanor and Robert, these are invented names for this narrative. But they represent countless real people who performed these tasks year after year, generation after generation, creating the material foundation on which medieval society rested. Their work was ordinary in the best sense of that word, part of the regular order of things, necessary and ongoing, worthy of being done well but not considered exceptional or remarkable. It was simply what needed to be done, what had always been done, what would continue to be done. There was a dignity in this ordinariness, in this commitment to necessary work performed with care and skill. The processes themselves had been refined over centuries, gradually improved through small adjustments and observations, creating methods that worked reliably and well. There was no dramatic innovation, no revolutionary change, just the slow accumulation of small improvements that made the work slightly easier or the results slightly better. This stability, this continuity, provided a framework for life. You knew what you would be doing next week, next month, next year. You knew your role and purpose. You understood how your work fit into the larger whole, how the cloth you helped create would clothe your neighbors, your family, perhaps yourself. There was something deeply calming about this vision of labor, something that speaks to human needs that our modern world often leaves unfulfilled. the need for patient, purposeful activity, the satisfaction of creating rather than just consuming, the tactile pleasure of working with materials in a direct, physical way, the reward of seeing something grow from nothing through your own efforts. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you can carry with you some sense of this medieval peace. The steady rhythm of the cards, the spinning drop spindle, the thump of the loom, the patient accumulation of small actions into something useful and lasting, the satisfaction of work done thoroughly, without hurry, with care and attention. Imagine yourself sitting with Agnes in the cottage doorway, carding wool while afternoon light shifts across the floor. Feel the soft scratch of the cards, the gradual transformation of tangled fiber into ordered fluff. Notice that there is no deadline, no anxiety about finishing. The work will be done when it's done. Or imagine standing with Thomas in the meadow, watching sheep graze. Notice how the sun warms your face, how the breeze carries the scent of grass and sheep. Observe how the sheep move slowly across the field, heads down, focused entirely on the present moment, on the grass before them. Or imagine sitting at the loom with Margaret, the shuttle passing through the shed. The rhythm of the work, creating a meditation, a state of presence that requires no effort, that simply exists as long as you maintain the motion. Press, pass, beat, press, pass, beat. The world narrows to just this task, just this moment, just this simple, satisfying work. In our age of hurry and stress, of multitasking and anxiety, there is medicine in these medieval rhythms. Not in the sense that we should return to medieval life, with all its hardships and limitations, but in the sense that we can learn from their relationship to work and time, from their acceptance of the pace that materials and processes require, from their understanding that rushing often creates worse results than patience does. The wool workers of medieval England knew something we have largely forgotten, that good work takes time, that some things cannot be rushed, that there is value in the process itself and not just in the finished product. They understood that a day spent carding wool, or spinning thread or weaving cloth, was a day well spent, regardless of how much was accomplished, because the work itself had meaning. And so we leave them to their tasks, these quiet workers whose labor clothed a civilization. We leave Agnes with her cards, Margaret at her loom, Thomas with his sheep, all of them working at their own pace, in their own time, creating through patient effort the essential stuff of life. The wool will still be there tomorrow, patient as ever, waiting to be transformed. The sheep will still grow their fleeces, season after season. The work will continue, as it always has, following the ancient rhythms, honoring the old ways, creating cloth through labor that is slow and steady and sure. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the rhythm of simple work lull you towards sleep. The wool workers do not need you to worry for them or hurry them along. They know what they're doing. They have done it before and will do it again. The work is patient. The wool is patient. And so can you be patient, releasing the urgency of the modern world, sinking into the slower rhythms of a time when work and life moved at a human pace. The sheep graze under an unhurried sky. The thread forms on the spindle. The cloth grows on the loom. All of it happening in its own time, according to its own necessity, beautiful in its ordinariness, complete in its patient persistence. Sleep well. Tomorrow the work continues. But tonight there is only rest, Only the quiet satisfaction of another day concluded. Only the peace of knowing that the wool is there, waiting, as it has always been, as it will always be, patient as stone, enduring as the seasons. Good night.